Okay, sound check. And it looks like we're ready to go. So this is where we begin our discussion in this class of three different economic models. This first model is called the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And then after that, we'll look at an interest rate and financial determination model called the loadable funds model. And then after that, we have our first exam. And when we return from that exam, we'll look at a series of Python simulation models of the macroeconomy. And so we have quite a bit of modeling ahead of us. It's for that reason that I'm counting on you to read the support material for the background on the model so I don't have to talk about it in class. So I want to remind you that to take a look at the course calendar, which has the links to all of the assignments. And here we are looking at the financial health of young America. Recall that was an assignment actually from the last module that you may have forgotten that I asked you to read. And I'm not asking you to read the entire document, just part of it, because we're going to continue to return to this issue of the income and wealth distribution in the United States, because it has the potential to play a part in the presidential elections, among other things. But moving on into the modeling section, there's a chapter there called Chapter 1, Economic Models. And I'm hoping you've read it by now, but you don't have to have read it by now. But it provides the background on how we approach modeling in general. And because I have that fairly well written, and because I also posted a video discussion of that chapter yesterday, I'm counting on you to go find the video discussion and use it separately, which gives me ample time to actually use the model in these next two lectures. So you'll see over the weekend, or since the last time I saw you, that two video lectures were posted, both of which I said I would post. One was the discussion of the national income and product accounts broken down into their log growth rates and then analyzed for standard deviations so we could use a statistical study to see if what we claim contributes to the business cycle, as is verified by our visual models, is confirmed with a statistical model, and it is confirmed, as you saw if you saw that video. And that's about a 25-minute video. And again, I'm not asking this class to understand the method so much as to simply comprehend what the result of using the method tells us about the reasons why we have a cyclical economy, what contributes to that cycle, what does not so much, and why, in general, business cycles have tended to dampen over the years as the structure of the U.S. economy changes. And it changes in a way that makes the mitigation of cycles a lot easier. And so that video clearly made that point. And so you need to look at that, and then you need to look at the video that discusses this Chapter 1 on economic models, where I talk a little bit about the limitations of these models and what we really can't use them for. I emphasize that they are not applied models. A lot of students misunderstand that about economic models. They think they're sort of business models that people use to set prices and the like, and that's almost never the case. They are models that attempt to generalize consumer and business behavior in a modeling format so that we can better understand that behavior, but they're not applied models in any sense of the word. There aren't very many applied models in economics. And then it introduces, for the first time in an organized way, the discussion of expectations and the role they play in modern economies, and especially in these models. And it distinguishes between two classes of expectations that you'll need to understand for the exam: adaptive expectations versus inflationary expectations, rational expectations, not inflationary expectations. Inflationary expectations is an example of the application of expectations. The two classifications of behavior are adaptive versus rational. So I want to make sure you understand that by reading that material. And I won't cover it very much in the class. I'll use it, but I won't explain its origin because it's thought within a week or so, if you haven't done it by now, that you will have seen all of that material and you'll understand its origin. So, so this slide here just reminds you of all of that so that we can get into the actual discussion of the course. Working in the background is I think the most interesting group of things going on is the impact of the fears of the coronavirus upon the finance markets. And the finance markets don't quite know what to make of the impact of the coronavirus. On some days, the markets seem to be rattled and scared by the prospect of the virus expanding or having some impact upon China or Chinese trade. It will definitely have a big impact upon China. And other days, it seems to be unconcerned. It sort of goes back and forth between these two levels of concern in a rather interesting way. I think there's an unfortunate aspect of the coronavirus that you should resist, and that is that the popular perception of it, of course, is running mad these days with American culture, but cultures overseas also exaggerating the impact of this, spreading rumors that are untrue about it, and it's spawning a new class of racism, which is to be expected, and I think it's something that should be combated. And it's racism against Asians specifically. There have been just thousands of incidents now of sort of incidents where people of Asian background, whether Chinese or not, are accused of being responsible for spreading the virus. And this has been covered substantially in the media and social media lately. So if you have friends here at the college who specifically are from China, try to be some comfort to them because they're perhaps a little worried about circumstances back in China. I don't think I don't think the disease is all that serious, and I don't think it's spreading all that fast either. The mortality rates, like I say, if you really adjust them for the fact that the number of cases are underreported, doesn't appear to actually be any higher than a bad case of influenza. And so the negative effects has actually been on the very severe crackdown on trying to stop the spread of the disease, unprecedented by the Chinese government basically freezing everybody in place, and that's having an unnerving effect upon people. But I suppose that students here who have a family living in China are somewhat concerned about that, so express your sympathy to them. And they may actually have been, not on these campuses, I wouldn't think, but if you go anywhere, they may possibly be witnesses to incidents that are really inappropriate, because those are being substantially described in the media in recent days, and we're above all of that, I would have to hope. So, returning to the humdrum and neutral politically world of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, it was interesting to see the complete and utter fantastically stupid breakdown in the Iowa caucuses last night after all of this media attention being lavished on how important those caucuses were. And the system became so complicated and so technological that so far they have still not even remotely come close to figuring out who won the caucuses last night because they overcomplicated the design of it. And so I guess we have to move on without ever really knowing who won Iowa, despite its celebrated importance for the last 2 weeks. Life in America. This is a model that is an aggregate of the standard microeconomic supply and demand model you've almost certainly seen if you've ever taken a course in economics at the high school level. I mean, you've seen the micro version of this because it's the standard supply and demand model that is found in just about every introductory economics textbook in the world. And you kind of know how it works. You have prices on one axis and you have quantity manufactured or offered as a service on the other axis. And there's a market clearing price that will allow consumers to buy what they want at a reasonable price and producers to be able to sell what they have to offer at a price that allows them to stay in business. And so you've seen that before, but this model is meant to be kind of an aggregation. And it is meant to represent the national economy as one giant factory, essentially producing a single good called gross domestic product. And so the output of this model is GDP as measured in real terms and the price trade-off is in the inflation rate rather than the general price level. So it looks a lot like the standard supply and demand model you find in microeconomics, but the quantity term is aggregated and in real terms, as it typically is in the micro model as well. And the price indicator, again, represents an inflation rate, such as the consumer price index that we discussed a couple of lectures ago, as a proxy for general inflation rates. Now, I kind of like this model. I think the person that has the most popular aggregate supply, aggregate demand model in writing is me. Because if you go into Google search and you write aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, I'm usually the first one that pops up. And it's because the actual writing of the chapter, which is chapter 2, I think, of what you read, is almost 20 years old, although it's been modified many times around. And people regard it as a much more clear chapter on how this works than some of the textbooks have. And so I get a steady stream of emails asking me questions about and thanking me for writing the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model for chapters, and professors asking if they can use the material in their class with attribution. Tend to be overseas colleges in poor nations that people can't afford textbooks, so they're scrambling around trying to find free material. And so I think I have become the world's foremost expert on aggregate supply, aggregate demand models. If the search index is used by Google as any measure of that. And so that's my single accomplishment in terms of my quest for fame. It may actually be my only accomplishment ever in my quest for fame. Now, there is something we have to justify about this model. We have to justify the unusual shape of the supply curve because it generally is shown as looking like this. And then we have to justify the downward slope of the demand curve, and that's a little harder to do than is typical because it is not a demand curve that is responding to a price level. It's a demand curve that is responding to an inflation rate. And so one of the reasons why I think the model was popular is if you take a look at other aggregate supply, aggregate demand models in textbooks, for example, they either have the price up there just as price, and then that makes it very difficult for them to use the model to explain inflation rates. They have to kind of do it with a story on the side. Or if they have the inflation rate on the ordinate, they don't explain how it got there. They don't explain its origin from its microeconomic foundation. And so I get all these messages from people saying you can't just label it inflation rate if it used to be the price level. You have to justify how you made that transition and explain how it's downward sloping. So I'd write back and I'd say, well, that's a math issue actually that most students wouldn't understand. It's easy to explain as a math issue, but it is not easy to explain it any other way. So they said, well, it would be useful if you add that to the chapter. So I did add it to the chapter, and it's kind of like an appendix edition because you have to understand a little bit about math to get the point. But that's one of the things I think that made the chapter popular because it became logically intact after I was able to do that. And so that may be my source of fame. Okay. Now, so we'll start with that tedious justification of the demand curve, and we'll move past that. I think it'll be easy for you to understand. Okay, so this is a comparative statics model.
Well, could you go back to the graph really quick, like as one that
Sure.
you should take at Econ in high school, like what exactly is going on, like what this graph is trying to...
Well, we haven't explained it yet. This is just,
okay.
I'm just saying we're going to explain it, okay? But because I haven't explained the supply and demand curve, so I'm going to systematically set up and explain it component by component right now, okay? That's just a visual image of where we're going to be going in our travels. So you start with a steady state equilibrium economy as an assumption. Remember what I said about the comparative static model? Oh, you actually wouldn't remember if you haven't seen the video because it's in the video. So in the video, I tell you methodologically what a comparative static model is and how it's used to overcome the fact that it doesn't represent time well. So this is one such model. It's the so-called comparative statics model. And a comparative statics model starts with an assumed equilibrium that you can explain as being the result of whatever's going on in the economy. Then you shock the economy, or you shock the model, and it causes a shift in one or more of the curves in the model, if it's a visual model. It moves to a new equilibrium, and then you explain the reason why it got to the new equilibrium. So it's a shock model that does not tell you how it got from A to B, but shows you that it did go from A to B and explains how it got there. And that's the sense in which it's comparative. So we're going to say that the primal source of nominal aggregate demand, which is demand for goods not adjusted for inflation, in other words, when we look at the price of the new recently released Audi W12 Speed Bentayga, which is an upgrade from the V8. The V8 only has 8 cylinders, and the W12 has 12 cylinders arranged in a W shape and is 790 horsepower. And they had a drag race with one on YouTube not long ago in competition with like a 911 Cabriolet and a McLaren and Ford Mustang, and it came in fourth, even though it weighs 6,200 pounds. So when we talk about my demand for that Audi, it's in terms of its current dollar value and not some inflation-adjusted value such as what that Audi is worth in 1968 dollars. So we talk about the primal source of nominal aggregate demand, nominal national income earned in the previous period. So we're saying in this model it's assumed that income that has been earned is the primary source of demand. And that becomes a budget constraint in the current period, and it has much the same effect as a budget constraint in the microeconomic model that you see. If you ever see a math version of the microeconomic model, the downward slope of the budget of the demand curve is due to the fact that the consumer has a static budget and must allocate spending among all choices made. And the higher the price of everything, the less you can buy, hence the downward slope of the demand curve. So in our model, we say that nominal national income earned in the previous period equaled nominal GDP in the previous period. So this, again, is kind of a Say's law style assumption, like the one I talked about the other day, which in turn equaled real GDP, Y times the price level in that period. So we say, basically, we had national output equal to GDP for the previous period, Y minus 1. National income was equal to that. This is a closed economy where we don't have an export market for the time being. We can add that later. And so this becomes our basis for demanding products in this time period. In this period, we have normalized that price period to a base, the price index to a base of 100, just for the sake of reference. You can always normalize any price index to 100 by saying, well, if this is going to be our month for the base, then we'll take the price index for this month and put it in the denominator of all of the other price indexes for other months, and that's normalizing the price index to 100 for this month. So this month would be worth 100 because this month's price divided by this month's price times 100 is equal to 100. And so we will also, for the sake of discussion, to make this a little easier to understand, normalize real GDP level to 1, and we'll say that maybe represents $100 billion or $100 trillion or $132.65 billion. We're normalizing it to 1. So given these two assumptions, given that we are at a steady state, this implies that our budget constraint is 100, and that is equal to the current price index times real GDP. Now, we're saying, therefore, if you want to derive the aggregate demand curve as a function of the price deflator, the price index, then you can say the assumption on the previous page implies that we are constrained at a national level by the following budget constraint. Our national income is equal to the budget we have divided by the general price level. And so that mapping, therefore, becomes a downward sloping mapping for that reason, because the price level's in the denominator. And so then we transform the price deflator to an inflation rate that is continuous rather than discrete by saying if you take every price for every time period, and then you take the prices for the next time period, if you take the log of those prices, the current divided by the past, then that is by definition the inflation rate. Is the continuous inflation rate, and that is also downward sloping. Now, so basically the argument that the demand curve is downward sloping for a price index is as follows. It's fairly simple. When you take a look at it mathematically, you say that we're concerned only about a mapping that is bounded. It has an upper bound and a lower bound, and it's way outside of the area of relevance for us, right? So we don't have to worry about whether it's asymptotic to the axes or anything like that. We just say the lower bound is above zero for price, and the upper bound is some high level that's nowhere close to the price that we have now. But the demand curve for the individual items that make up the economy are all monotonically downward because of the construction that's justified in macroeconomic theory. Now, monotonically downward means that they slope down for all prices for all people with no exceptions, all right? So then you say, okay, then if you take a demand curve that represents times T, that's monotonically downward sloping. Then you take a demand curve that represents T plus 1, that's monotonically downward sloping. And so if you divide one by the other, then one mapping that is monotonically downward sloping divided by another that is the same is also downward sloping. And then you take the natural log of any downward sloping mapping, then it is downward sloping. So you start with the downward sloping assumption, you turn it into a price index that is a log of two differences in prices, and it never stops being downward sloping. So all you have to do is justify that it has a negative slope everywhere, and the model will, with that property, always come to a pricing equilibrium. It's also true in microeconomics. You say, well, that seems kind of esoteric argument. Why don't you just declare that it's downward sloping and move on with it? Well, it's the nature of economics to kind of deal with stuff like that. If you take microeconomic theory at the introductory level, you're getting a very, very superficial review, typically, of how deep that theory can go. And sometimes it goes to a level that borders on silly. But basically, the mathematicians that have contributed to the theory, who have won the Nobel Prize for their contribution, like Gerard de Brue, build these huge general equilibrium models like this, but more on the micro side, as pure logical models that begin with certain very clearly articulated assumptions that go to certain conclusions, and in the logical development of the model, there are no breaches in logic anywhere. And that's why Gerard de Brue won the Nobel Prize in the early 80s, right around the time I got here. Because in the old classical economic theory, when you went through this discussion of the consumer indifference curves, if you remember that, and the production functions and all of that, there were all sorts of leaps of faith in the model getting to its conclusion. And the conclusion is, literally, that there exists a singular vector of positive prices that will always clear the market. That is the logical conclusion of the general equilibrium model, that there exists a single vector of prices that will always clear the market. And there was not logical continuity in the assumptions that started the model to that conclusion until de Brue came along and turned the model into a set theoretic model and used a theory called Kakutani's fixed point theorem to put in all the stuff that was missing, and the model became logically perfect from the beginning to the end. And all of this discussion about the need to have monotonically increasing or decreasing mappings of these continuous functions in his model was integral to that proof. And so it may seem strange to you when you hear an economist talking about these odd little details about why the demand curve is going down. It's actually part of the logical tradition of how these models are developed. So it's sufficient for you to know it has a negative slope, right? And you say, yeah, that's intuitive. I don't need a bigger explanation than that. It's kind of intuitive. Why would it have a positive slope? That would imply the higher the level of inflation, the more we would buy. So anyway, the demand curve does have a downward slope. And it's not linear, even though in the drawing, of course, it's linear because it's easier to draw it as linear than nonlinear. So we don't worry too much about, you understand that, obviously. So we shock our steady state with something that impacts the budget. So we have our model with its production function, which I have yet to explain. Its downward sloping demand function, which is simply an aggregation of the microeconomic demand function, summed up for everything. And there it sits. And so it is a comparative statics model. So in that model, what do we do to shock it? Well, our primary budget constraint, again, our capacity to buy what is available for sale, is constrained by the fact that our income has an upper bound. And historically, that was a significant constraint. But we have found ways to go beyond that upper bound institutionally, and those methods explain how we can shift this curve out. So, for example, as we say here, our primary budget constraint is based upon nominal national income from the previous period, but new credit allows us to expand it out. So, for example, if in this economy we offer new credit in the aggregate to the economy, that allows us to increase our spending beyond the constraint provided by our budget. And that is shown in this model as shifting the demand curve out. Exports will shift it out. Net savings, on the other hand, will contract it some, as we'll see. So anything that influences aggregate net purchasing power can shock this in or out, which is why the expansion of reasonable and moderate credit is essential to economic growth. Now, again, I've already been talking a lot about credit and debt in this economy and the important role it plays now. Basically, what this model is going to be arguing is that the sort of solid expansions we've had in the modern era are mostly funded by the general slow expansion of credit and debt in our economies. This simply makes it possible to drift these demand curves out beyond where they would otherwise be if the credit wasn't available. It's also, though, explains a little bit about how this economy keeps slogging along with very few people in the economy experiencing substantial increases in their income. Again, only a small segment of the economy does that. How is that possible then for the economy to have consistent 2 and 3% rate growth rates in real terms? And one of the answers is because of our access to credit. So we're jumping ahead a little bit with that, though. So now we have our downward sloping demand curve when we can shock it by providing credit. In the computer simulation model of this in Python, then we will have a Federal Reserve System that can arbitrarily increase the amount of credit in the economy by conducting what are called open market operations. And when they do that in the model, it moves the demand curve out and raises the economy to a higher new equilibrium.
Why do exports allow us to expand our purchasing power?
Because exports give us cash by virtue of the fact that we sold them overseas. And so if you have a strong net exporting economy, then you can basically spend the revenue you make from those exports to expand your economy. Now, that isn't characteristic of our economy, but it explains how China grew. For example, between 1970 up until the present, they grew on their export trade for the largest part. So we'll see examples of that later on. Now, what about the supply curve? When we take a look at the supply curve, it always has this shape. And a supply curve in a micro model won't have this kind of shape. A supply curve in a micro model will often be drawn as simply a linear upward sloping supply curve. This one, though, has a flat region, then it sharply bends and becomes very inelastic in a vertical region or near vertical region. And the flat region is referred to as the non-inflationary region, And the region to the right, as you look at it, is referred to as the inflationary region. And there's a sharp turning point there that is associated with a number of economic statistics, of which one we will emphasize in this class. That is to say, there's a correlation between these economic statistics and whether we are going around the curve on this supply curve or not. It represents the tendency or capacity of our nation's manufacturers and providers of services to be able to increase their output to us in a non-inflationary way or without expecting price increases. And it tends to suggest that there is often a lot of capacity to expand output with no inflationary pressures at all that could be represented, for example, down in the lower region of the non-inflationary supply curve. So if you're down in through here we're not. We're at this intersection point labeled as E for the equilibrium. But if this economy had been in a recession and the demand curve was down in through here, this implies that you can increase aggregate demand through here and have substantially high growth rates without much danger of inflation. It also suggests, however, that once you pass that point where we are in this graph at point E, any effort to further stimulate the demand in the economy will result in more and more inflation and less real output. Because you can plainly see that given that this is real output on this graph here, and this is the inflation rate on this graph here, when you're going through here, you're getting some sizable increases in real output with no inflationary effect. But if you're out here, you are getting very little in the way of real output, and most of the increase in demand there will result in inflationary pressures. There's a whole series of explanations for why that kink bends like that, but a comment written in 1815 by the great economist David Ricardo probably summarizes as well as anybody why the aggregate supply curve has that sharp kink when he wrote, "You can't grow a bushel of wheat in a flower pot." And that comment was made in reference to a long discussion he was having with the famous classical economist Thomas Robert Malthus. And Malthus at the time was writing his very famous essay on population, where he was basically arguing that the world had this tendency for population to outstrip the world's resources to feed the population, and that would result in famine from time to time. And Ricardo and Malthus were good friends, and they both wrote books that sort of centered around this discussion that they had about this very issue. So Ricardo's argument that he made in that context was, if you take a look at a small economy that consists of a large island, like the economy of Great Britain or England and England's domain at that time, then you could expand agricultural production with the economy, as Malthus suggested, only up to a point. But once you got into a point where you were starting to use all of your arable land and all of the land that was close to a water source, then if you continued to try to increase agricultural production past that point, that would only be done if the prices of agricultural products started to rise to motivate the excessively high cost of producing agricultural products like corn and wheat on marginal land. And so he argued, therefore, that sure, a growing population will, by virtue of its demand, encourage farmers to grow, to feed the population, but only at ever higher prices once you have used up all of your arable or easy-to-use agricultural land in the country. And this is the kind of argument that he made. So the summary statement he made for that was, again, you can't grow a bushel of wheat in a flower pot. That means that you are constrained ultimately with an upper limit by your existing natural resources and your labor force and your state of plant and equipment, and any effort to really produce beyond that constraint is going to result in price inflation. a little bit less output, a little bit more price inflation until you move into a distinctly inflationary period. So that's why the aggregate supply curve has this configuration. It reflects the reality of the fact that an economy that is underutilized can expand production a lot with no price pressure at all. But once you begin to use your resources effectively and then begin to demand more than what you actually have, further output past that is going to result only in price inflation. Now, this term here is often associated with, kind of loosely, not too strongly anymore, as the arrow says, a capacity utilization rate of around 85%. And I've used that as the sort of guideline on some of the statistics that point to being at that turning point, because in the past they've had some accuracy. The relationship is kind of breaking down in the modern era because manufacturing is not as important in this economy as it used to be. This would be more relevant for a company like China where manufacturing matters more, but it's still relevant enough for us to discuss it. The capacity utilization rate is measured by the Department of Labor, and this is published by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. And it's kind of a rough measure of the extent to which our manufacturing part of the economy is running at, quote, full capacity. Now, it's kind of hard to even define full capacity. What do you mean by that? And the suggestion is that when you are using manufacturing capacity, if you pass a certain threshold, then the manufacturing capacity or the machinery itself begins to wear out prematurely. It's like, for example, a good example is running electrical power with diesel-fired generators. If you don't go through a maintenance cycle with them because demand for electricity is so high, you're able to meet that demand, but then the life of the generators begins to decline because of the impact of the excess use upon the generators themselves. So full capacity isn't really 100%. Full capacity may be a number like 88 or 90 or 90% for a factory. And so anytime you start to approach anything above about 85% for the national average for all factories, that means that some factories out there for the busier industries are running capacity utilization well above 90%, and that's pretty much regarded as full capacity. And so those businesses are beginning to face cost push pressures, supply pressures of all kinds, having trouble keeping costs down. And so they're in a business environment where they're inclined to try to pass on higher prices to consumers in order to stay in business or to simply recover their cost of operation. So when you see it reaching a peak around here, for example, and around there, and again, we're looking at the peaks of business cycles, and this is not perfectly correlated with the peaks, as you can see. It's only roughly correlated with the peaks. When you hit this 87%, that means that some of those businesses, because that's the national average, maybe running at 95 or even close to 100%. So they're experiencing labor shortages or shortages of lumber, fuel, concrete, agricultural products, whatever it is that they are using in their manufacturing, or if this were to apply to services, which it can be used to apply to services, there's just not a good statistic for the service side of this stuff. It means that there are inflationary pressures beginning to build in that industry. On the supply side, remember when we talked about the impact of prices upon production, the variable in manufacturing that tends to put prices up are simply rising costs, obviously, because those costs are pushed on from the manufacturer to the consumer. So if wages are rising, then typically manufacturing costs will be rising with it. And during a labor shortage, such as the kind we're beginning to have, for example, in the trucking industry, in the airline industry, for example, then you can expect to see ultimately that there will be some price increases coming from those shortages. There is, believe it or not, a shortage of truck drivers currently in the United States. There's a shortage of law enforcement officers. There's an enforcement that's pretty acute of pilots in general, and a very serious shortage of helicopter pilots currently in the United States. And so when that's true in some industries and not in others, then those industries that are impacted are beginning to see their prices increase. And if you realize that a price index is a weighted average of prices across everything, then if some of those things that have higher weights are starting to rise, then obviously the aggregate index is starting to rise with it. And so that's why the increase in this is loosely associated with inflationary pressures. And if you're beginning to go through these periods right through here, if the aggregate demand continues to grow, then the inflationary pressures are going to continue to grow with them. Now, you remember right through here that this actually did ultimately result into some double-digit price increases. This is only part of that story, but it is part of that story as we're going to see. When we look at the modern era, though, we see no inflationary pressure to speak of right through here, because here we see manufacturing, of course, coming down really sharply in 2009 to 67% capacity. That's quite low. And although we've had a recovery, the recovery has been nowhere near where it was in through there. And so in manufacturing, there's been nothing close to anything that puts inflationary pressure on manufacturing and manufactured goods in the United States. When you take a look, in fact, at the monthly data, going back to 2012, you can see this more plainly. Remembering that we were looking at capacity utilization rates running above 85% in the inflationary period that we had in the United States, we can see here that not only is it well below that, the peak that we see here is not even 80%, but it's also been cycling. It came down again, and this, of course, is explained by the fact that we were having that mortgage meltdown and the crisis that was a consequence of that, and it started to rise, but very strangely, again, beginning in early 2019, it started to come down again and is continuing to fall at the present time. And you often hear news about this in the U.S. economy. You'll hear that manufacturing is, although it's less important to the economy than it used to be, nonetheless manufacturing seems to be going through a slump. The auto industry is, of course, the largest industry that uses manufacturing, and they're kind of going through a slump right now. The sales for the big three have been coming in. One of the reasons that Tesla's done so well, of course, Tesla's on a manic tear right now, heading toward $1,000, it looks like, is because the big three are reporting declines in sales. And in 2019, there would have been declines in sales across the board, except fleet sales actually rose during the year. Those are business sales. So consumer sales fell off in 2019, but fleet sales kind of made up for that. But now in 2020, it's beginning to look like this is going to be about a 16 million car year, when an 18 million car year would be full capacity. So automobile sales are an example of why this is again coming back down. Now that it is coming back down mystifies me a little bit. I'm not quite sure. I haven't seen a decent explanation for why it rose so high and then all of a sudden came back down so much, because that's quite a decline. So we'll keep an eye on it. But the implication, though, is in the context of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. There's no sense in which we feel that we are anywhere near the portion of that aggregate supply curve that begins to threaten inflation. We're at a capacity utilization rate way below that threshold at the present time. And this is why, one of the reasons why you don't hear much about inflationary pressures in the modern era. Nobody really believes that we have to worry about them very much, and I agree with that. It's not just this, obviously. There's a whole bunch of things that contribute to the sense that we're having inflation in our future or not, but this is one key element, and this indicates no reason to fear inflation. So as we say here, one of the reasons that the Federal Reserve System indeed did go on an easing policy, in other words, increasing the supply of the credit growth rate in this economy, was because of this. For example, so I think the Federal Reserve became a little bit concerned that this number and similar numbers were falling. And so this is one of the reasons why they have pushed interest rates back down to close to historically low levels. Okay, so we've justified the appearance of the supply and demand curve. Let's take a look at the model itself. Now again, the way we do this is explained in that chapter 1 on modeling and the video that has been posted. You're losing control of all your little colored pencils. The way these models work in these comparative statics models, they look very simple. There's two lines they cross, and you say where they cross, that's an equilibrium. It can't get much simpler than that. But underneath those is a mathematical structure that's considerably more complex. Those models are useful because they're good pedagogical models to introduce people to the concept of market clearing equilibria, right? But underneath them, you can find some complexity, and you can pull that complexity out in, for example, a simulation model later, like we're going to do. But here's what's being assumed about those supply and demand curves. We just have the supply and demand curves, and in the sense of a market model, they represent the tendencies, the stress of two countervailing parties working against each other to some extent to come to a market clearing price. The producers want to sell their products at the highest possible price, and you consumers, or we consumers, want to buy it at the lowest possible price. So we come together in the market, and through the bargain of the market, although that bargain is, of course, very indirect in the modern market, we arrive at a price clearing price that everybody's happy with, or reasonably happy with. Underneath our activity, though, is all of those variables in the economy that motivate that behavior. And so the demand curve is therefore a function of a large list of exogenous variables. Some of them are listed here. We don't worry about too many of them in an introductory course. The ones that are either circled or highlighted by yellow are the ones that we're going to emphasize. But we have others available because we need to concede that there's a lot of things that influence our demand. So on the demand side, we say we've got our income, of course, but our wealth as well. And this is where wealth expectations matter a great deal. Remember, I've already said that when we have a surge in wealth expectations, that consumer demand goes up. The population size and all matters at a national. The level of interest rates, because we finance what we buy. And so when interest rates come down, then demand will go up. And that allows me to explain these plus and minus signs. That shows the presumed sensitivity of demand to that variable. And so you can see on the demand side that most of the columns are pluses, but interest rate is negative. And so that means that there's an inverse relationship between interest rates and demand. When interest rates come down, demand will rise. And when interest rates rise, demand will come down. And so that inverse relationship is indicated by the negative. Now, taxation, of course, reduces our demand because it reduces our capacity to spend. It reduces our budget. It reduces our income to our after-tax disposable income. So the higher the level of taxes, the lower the level of demand. But on the other side, if the government spends money, then government demand right above it can offset it. So in a large economy with a large government, there's this trade-off between the impact of taxes upon our consumer spending and the impact of government spending upon demand. And we're going to see that that trade-off is actually quite complex in this economy, and we'll look at that when we look at the simulation models. Once again, though, we have these new categories that we call expectations, and again, that is explained in detail in that chapter 1 that I'm asking you to read. And again, I remind you, as you do that, to explore the difference between what are called adaptive expectations and rational expectations, because I'll start using those terms soon. And we're saying that not only do inflationary expectations, the formation of those, impact our demand, so do wealth expectations, income expectations, and even interest rate change expectations. So that means that if we anticipate that these variables will change in the future, even though they have not yet changed, our consumer behavior will respond to that, and they'll respond to that along the lines suggested by these signs. When we get to the supply side, the biggest component that affects the supply is cost. Any cost that is felt by a business will cause a contraction of the supply curve. That's consistent with the approach to this in microeconomic theory, where you have your production functions and things like that factoring into where that supply curve goes if you've had a microeconomics course. Here we have interest rates being a negative impact upon supply, foreign supply just being competition, taxation being negative and the like. But for the largest part, the emphasis we'll see here in our application of the model, which is in the next lecture, will be on the cost impact upon the supply curve and the effect of that upon inflation. Now, if we have this delineation of supply and demand components and assume signs, that implies we have underneath this a core mathematical model that is probably a nonlinear model, where we say that we can think of the supply function in that model as a function of all of these variables that are listed on the previous page, such as wealth and income and inflationary expectations and interest rates and so forth, where the first partial derivative of the supply or demand curve to that variable is determined by the sign. So back here where we say that this sign is negative, the impact of interest rates right there upon the demand curve is negative, then that says in the context of the model, we're therefore assuming that the sensitivity of aggregate demand to the interest rate, the first partial derivative has a negative sign in the context of the math model that we would look at. And that becomes more important when you're using simulation models where all of these coefficients begin to actually have values. So even though the model itself, in its appearance, is very simple, it can represent something underneath that is quite complex. And we kind of get into that complexity a little bit in this class by looking at simulations, because you can see the effect of the complexity through the simulations without necessarily understanding all of the math that you're looking at. Okay, so what good are these models? Why in the world are we bothering with them? Because we're going to use them to begin to answer questions we have about the economy. If we can set up a logical structure where we can express a question, then perhaps we can give a logical answer through the input of a model, and then we can sometimes evaluate that in the context of the real economy. So this model is good for these questions. We can ask ourselves the question, what causes inflation? And if you've taken a macroeconomics course before, or if you watched a program on YouTube or on television about the causes of inflation, you'll often see these explanations like, inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods. And that's typically not true. That's typically not the cause of inflation. It was at one time, but it's not so much anymore. One of my greatest crushing disappointments in life, as you grow older, you just get scarred with experiences like this, is that I turned on the television one day and there was a program that explained economics. And of all the people doing the explaining, Mr. Spock was the person doing the explaining. And Leonard Nimoy, he had this program, what causes the economy to do this, causes the economy to do that. Now, I worshipped Mr. Spock because he was the absolute epitome of logic. Mr. Spock is someone that you should all aspire to emulate as young students. And so when he gave an explanation that inflation literally is caused by too much money chasing too few goods, I was absolutely crushed. It destroyed whatever sense of respect I had for Mr. Spock because it was simply wrong and it was counterlogical. And I'd never seen Spock do anything like that in my life. So I stopped watching Star Trek and I haven't been back since. The program consisted of a little cartoon, and the cartoons were like television sets and shoes and cars running and wads of $100 bills chasing them. And he was explaining this as too much money chasing too few goods. So why do I say it doesn't cause inflation? Because there's no statistical evidence that it's true. That's why. During inflationary periods that we have, you take measures of money, however defined, and prices are rising, and money supply is going down at the same time. There's no current modern statistical correlation between money supply growth rates and inflation rates. So it's simply wrong. There's another explanation for inflation that is, as you might guess, more sophisticated and a little bit better than the one provided by Mr. Spock. I used to sit on dissertation committees for the Claremont Graduate University, and I had an experience to where I couldn't do it anymore. We had a student from another country. It wasn't because he was from another country he did this. He just wasn't a very good student. And so he wrote this dissertation that effectively argued that inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods. He said that all inflations have a monetary cause. And so he took the country that he was from, and he got annual data. This is a PhD dissertation we're talking about, by the way. We're not talking about a freshman two-page paper that has to be turned in desperation in the last week of class like you do it here, right? This is a dissertation where you're supposed to spend years, doing hardcore research to prove this out. So he took about 10 years of annual data. So he had like 120 observations, and he had the GDP of his country, and he had the inflation rate of his country, and he had the money supply growth rate, the money supply, and he did an elementary regression of the money supply on the inflation rate, and it came out with a high R squared. And so he said, I've proved my case. Write it up. I deserve a PhD. I wouldn't allow him to get it because I said, that's not PhD level research, for crying out loud, right? You can't. Everything's going up in these economies now. Batting averages are going up. That doesn't mean that batting averages are the cause of inflation. You have to go back and look at the work of Milton Friedman if you want to make this kind of argument and see how he so carefully structured his argument from a much larger database, right, with a more structured model using log growth rates, for example, where the correlation just completely falls apart when you do that. And so I was adamant that he wasn't going to get his PhD unless he changed, and so they just kicked me off the committee. And I never went back to sit on one of those again, but I'll never forget that. That was a long time ago. I was never invited back because I was such a troublemaker. I actually held students to high standards. But I'll never forget that PhD. I don't know if he ever got his PhD or not. I certainly hope not. He's out there doing considerable damage now, if he is. So inflation can be looked at with this, and you say, well, inflation is actually caused by too much money or something like that. Well, yeah, maybe, but what happened? What about the second question? Because when we had those inflations that I've talked about, the economy was in a recession. The economy was actually at the peak of the inflation. The economy was at the trough of a recession. So that sort of disputes the notion that this was demand-based inflation or that there was too much money chasing anything. The inflation happened during a period of recession. As prices went up, the demand went down. Or as the economy fell back, the prices went up. So how can there be inflation with recession? Because the standard simple explanation as I've already given you, in fact, about the business cycle, is that at the end of the business cycle, there's inflationary pressures because you're running out of labor supplies and the like, which is true. And that would mean typically, therefore, that the peak of inflation is around the peak of the business cycle, not the trough of the business cycle. Well, this model gives you a very easy explanation about how you can have inflation with recession, and it throws water upon the argument that there's a very simple explanation for all of this stuff, because there's typically not. What is the role of expectations in general and inflationary expectations? They're very robust in modern economic studies. They matter actually more than actual measures of what we expect. In other words, expected wealth and perceived wealth matters statistically more than actual wealth in hand in the modern day economy. We're much more influenced about where we think we're going to go than where we are at the present moment. And so that complicates the issue a lot, especially when it comes to inflationary expectations. And as soon as we get to that explanation, you'll see why we need to distinguish between what are called rational inflationary expectations and adaptive inflationary expectations. When we start talking about financial market performance, such as the stock market, about Tesla in particular, you're looking at expectations purely driving these markets without any regard for current nominal values of anything, right? You're looking at earnings reports, and those earnings reports say a little bit about how well that these companies are doing. But I play these earnings reports, and I play them on a very large scale. And what matters on those earnings reports are what they call their forward guidance, which is their statements about where they think they might go next. That's where all the pops to the stock comes from, not from their actual report of their earnings. So this discussion of expectations is going to play a very major role. What is the effect of productivity changes? This will end up being an important issue. Productivity was rising during my lifetime a lot, and now it's stalled out during your lifetime, and nobody's quite sure why it's stalled out as much as it has, but the data shows that it's not rising anymore. And I think that, as I've said before, we're probably ready for a new spurt, and you're going to be providing that spurt, because when you think about the impact of self-driving vehicles and of robotics and similar technologies, those are going to be probably enormous contributors to productivity gains. The use of automation in healthcare may be what finally saves healthcare and makes it affordable again. And so some of you, there's a very sizable number of mud entrepreneurs who get involved in the healthcare industry, even though we offer no training here at the undergraduate level in anything associated with health. You know, our biology department, for example, is not a pre-med biology department, as some are. And so, nonetheless, some of our most successful entrepreneurs, including some who I know personally, are making their fortunes by improving productivity in healthcare, and their stories are very interesting. And of course, it's beneficial to the general population because we have to figure out a way to get these healthcare costs under control, no matter whether we adopt Donald Trump's method of simply throwing it up or Bernie Sanders' method of providing it for everybody. The real issue is the cost control, and that's going to be something you're going to provide the solution to. When are wage increases justified at the national level? Because sometimes they're not. Sometimes in the European model, for example, when wages are granted where there's not productivity gains, that results in pure inflation and has a very devastating impact upon the long-term health of the economy. And what is the pathology of the business cycle in the context of this model? The chapter on the loanable funds model ends with that discussion. How do we go back to revisit the pathology of the business cycle in this model? And it's pretty easy to do. I think that with this, that's a good stopping point, because the next half of this lecture will be answering all these questions with applications. And this will give you a chance to catch up on some of the reading if you aren't caught up already. And over the weekend, of course, we moved right from this model into the loanable funds model. So you do want to try to stay abreast of the reading to the best of your ability, because we're going through this stuff pretty fast. So, okay, we'll see you on Thursday, and we'll begin to use the model to answer these questions that we have here.